find working with vinyl a little bit intimidating, then make sure you watch the entire video, as we're going to be going over 12 of my most favorite tips and tricks for working with vinyl. Make sure you stick around for the last 3 because they're probably the most important game-changing tips that you will see. My name is Kelly, and let's get clacking. Number 12 is to have a certain type of weeding tool. Now, weeding tools can come in many different shapes and sizes, and I would probably recommend having a few of them once you're on your journey a little bit, but just to start off with, I would recommend at least one of them. Now, the weeding tool has a little bit of a hook at the end, and I find for me it is the easiest one to use. But for many other people, there are a few other ones. One of the options here is to take a needle and to put it into the end of a clutch pencil. Now, you do need to make sure that the size of the needle corresponds to the size of the clutch pencil, otherwise it'll keep slipping out and that'll be a pain. So if you go for a higher clutch pencil size, you might need to go for a higher or a thicker needle size. So just keep that in mind when you're putting those together. Number 11 is to have a scrap holder. Now, when you are weeding vinyl, those little bits, especially adhesive vinyl, those little bits get everywhere. And if you're not careful, they can actually land back on your project, and that makes it very difficult to actually pull them up again, as vinyl tends to stick to vinyl very well. So by having something like this, what you're actually going to do is you're going to save yourself a lot of headache and make sure that your projects end up clean and your workspace is quite neat at the end of the day. Number 10 is to make sure that you are using your light grip mat. And if you are not a Cricut user, make sure you're using a mat that is relatively old. Don't use a brand new mat, a standard grip or a strong grip mat for vinyl, especially when you're using the Oracle or Graphitac brands, as those have a paper backing. And if your mat is too sticky, that paper backing is going to tear off, and you won't necessarily destroy your mat, but it'll be a bit of a pain to clean. So by using the light grip mat, you're making sure that when you're pulling the mat off the vinyl, you're not going to be pulling the paper with it too. And that leads me into point number 9, is to when you're working with vinyl, especially adhesive vinyl, make sure that you flip the mat over and you pull the mat away from the vinyl, because if you don't, you may curl the vinyl and that will be a little bit of a problem. Number 8 is if you are struggling with vinyl adhering to whatever surface that you are putting the vinyl onto. Very often we place the vinyl on immediately and then we pull the transfer tape off and the vinyl comes along with the transfer tape. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do in this case. Number 1 is to take your burnishing tool and to make sure that you're burnishing the vinyl onto the blank that you're using. If you've already done that, then what you can do is to just leave the vinyl alone for half an hour or an hour or so. The adhesive on vinyl cures over time. So by leaving it to cure for an hour or so, what you'll be doing is you'll be making sure that the vinyl is going to be sticking to whatever you want it to stick to, and you should have less of a problem removing the backing. Now, of course, this doesn't apply to things like silicone, as pretty much nothing sticks to silicone. And of course, if you're wanting to put something onto silicone, you're going to need to look at an actual printing method, as I've seen that some of those are the only ways that you can get stuff to stick to silicone. Number 7 is to not put vinyl onto items that you want to have in contact with food. Vinyl is not food safe because of the adhesive, so if you want to put vinyl onto a plate or onto a mug, please make sure that it is purely for decorative purposes only. Number 6 is a trick that I learned, which is great to use if you have a lot of removable vinyl, and that is to put Mod Podge over removable vinyl. This would only really be applicable for things that are mostly decorative. So if you have a piece of vinyl that you've put on a decorative plate, or if you've put it on to a piece of wood or something like that, like as a Christmas ornament as an example, you can put Mod Podge over it and then you'll make sure that the vinyl will stay there permanently and you won't need to worry about it falling off. Tip number 5, and this is probably also another one of my favorite tips, and that's to layer with silicone paper. You can also use baking paper, as what you will need is you'll need something that's slightly transparent so that you can see the layers underneath it. Now, of course, the vinyl doesn't stick to the silicone paper, so you can put the vinyl on top and you can still see the layer that is underneath as it is slightly transparent, and you can much easier actually layer your vinyl projects and get them lined up perfectly. Tip number 4 is something that absolutely everybody should remember to do when you're working with vinyl, is to wipe down the surface that you are going to be applying your vinyl onto with rubbing alcohol and using a lint-free cloth. Every time we touch something, we end up placing oils onto that surface. What then happens is that stops the vinyl adhesive from curing properly. So you might find that you'll have a lower lifespan with your products, and if you have very fine details, you'll probably find that they come up a lot easier. Number 3 is something that I cannot state enough, and that is to please do test cuts. Test cuts are so incredibly important when you're working with pretty much anything. I say this about 200,000 times, but it is super important, especially when you're working with a new type of vinyl. As an example, I worked with the Cricut shimmer vinyl, and the shimmer vinyl is notoriously bad for not weeding properly. But once I'd done my test cuts, I changed my cut settings, it cut and weeded like a dream. So that just goes to show that you really need to make sure that you're getting your test cuts perfect in order to save you a lot of stress and hassle in the future, because these things can be very frustrating. Not all types of vinyl is very cheap, so if you end up using an expensive vinyl and you mess up an entire project, that's a lot of money down the drain that could have been avoided by doing a simple test cut. If you're looking for a video on how to do that, I will leave a link up in the top for you. Number 2 is to use weeding boxes, and I'm laughing because I almost never do this myself, and it's something that I always forget to do, and I'm going to try and tell myself to, Kelly, use weeding boxes. So what weeding boxes are, so it's a little box that's placed around a particular element of whatever it is that you're weeding. This allows you to weed the actual design piece by piece and not have to weed an entire page worth of cut vinyl. Weeding an entire page worth of cut vinyl is dangerous because what will happen, and this has happened to me so many times, you weed a part and then you accidentally drop it or something like that and it falls back and it lands on your project and it lands onto a letter that you've been struggling to weed, and now you've got to recut that letter or you've got to recut the whole thing because it's been messed up a little bit. So weeding boxes mostly removes that problem, and it allows you to weed your designs in sections, which is really, really great, especially for those that are new to the craft. And my number 1 top tip is reverse weeding. If you're cutting something that is relatively thin and intricate, then reverse weeding might be a better way to do it. What reverse weeding is you place the transfer tape onto the design before you've weeded anything. I mean, you can remove the small little bits in the middle if you want. And then what you do is you actually pull the transfer tape back, and you then pull out the design or the words that you've now cut, and the words then stay onto the transfer tape with the negative side staying onto the paper backing. So that's a little bit of an easier way to do it if you're really struggling to get the letters to stay flat. Many people find that this works really well. This video is 22 Cricut tips that'll help you along your journey. Subscribe to my channel for more videos in the future, and I'll see you next time. And remember, be kind to someone today. See you soon.